Every runway a seaplane uses disappears the moment it leaves the ground. The lake closes over. The surface smooths. There is no trace that anything ever happened. This is the only aircraft on Earth that takes off from something that does not remember it. Before the morning light has found the far shore, the lake is a mirror. Not approximately a mirror, not almost a mirror, but an exact, uncanny replica of the sky above it, so precise that the tree line at the water's edge appears to continue downward into the surface, as if the world has been folded along a crease. The mountains, where there are mountains, are doubled. A single duck moving across the near edge of the lake draws a perfect V behind it, the only mark on the entire surface, and then even that closes and the water is still again. A float plane sits at a dock somewhere along the shore. Its aluminum floats rest on the surface with the patient, settled quality of a boat that has been tied here all night. The engine is not yet running. The propeller is stopped. The whole aircraft is quiet in a way that aircraft parked on concrete runways rarely are, because a float plane at rest on water does not sit rigidly on fixed gear. It moves in very small ways with the water beneath it, a faint bobbing motion, so gentle it is barely perceptible, a slow, steady breath. If you found this video as you are winding down for the night, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to Simple Science and stay with us. Everything we make is designed to carry you quietly toward rest. The essential fact about a seaplane is that its runway is not fixed. Every other aircraft in commercial or general aviation uses a runway that was built, measured, inspected, and published in a navigational chart with its exact dimensions and surface condition documented. The runway is there before the aircraft arrives, and still there after it leaves. A floatplane pilot has none of that certainty. The water surface they are going to land on today may be the same lake they landed on yesterday, but it is not the same water. The wind may be different. The wave height may be different. The current near the inlet where two lakes connect may be running faster after last night's rain. The light may be falling at an angle that makes the surface difficult to read. Every approach to every seaplane landing begins with a fresh assessment of conditions that cannot be fully known until the aircraft is close enough to see them clearly. This is not a disadvantage so much as a defining characteristic. The floatplane pilot develops, over thousands of landings, a kind of observational literacy that land-based pilots rarely need. They read the water the way a sailor reads the sea, looking at the texture of the surface to determine wind direction and speed, identifying the flat, calm band on the upwind side of a lake that indicates the protected zone, watching for the slight darkening of water that means a puff of wind is moving across it. The water tells the story of what is happening at the surface, and the experienced pilot reads it from several hundred feet up. The physics of landing and taking off from water are genuinely different from anything that happens on a runway. When a floatplane sits at rest on the water, it is being supported by buoyancy, the same force that keeps a boat afloat. The floats displace a volume of water equal in weight to the aircraft, and that displaced water pushes back up. The aircraft is a boat. As power is applied and it begins to accelerate, the relationship between the aircraft and the water surface changes completely. Hydrodynamic lift begins to push the floats upward. The aircraft rises from a floating position to a planing position, riding on the surface of the water rather than in it like a speedboat hull or like water skis. At this point, the float plane is neither a boat nor an aircraft, but something in between, transitioning rapidly from one state to the other, and the moment when the floats finally break free from the water and the aircraft becomes purely aerodynamic is one of the more elemental sensations in all of flying. The moment it lifts off, the lake closes behind it. The surface heaves. By the time the aircraft is 100 feet above the water, there is no evidence on the surface below that anything happened at all. This is where the story of the seaplane begins, on water that does not hold a memory, under a sky that opens in every direction, above a runway that disappears the instant it is no longer needed. The morning of January 26, 1911, was clear over San Diego Bay. Glenn Curtiss was 32 years old, already famous in aviation circles for winning the first Gordon Bennett Trophy race in 1909, and for being the first person to fly a significant distance in the United States outside of the Wright brothers. He had set up a winter flying school at North Island, a flat stretch of land at the northern edge of the bay, and he had been quietly modifying one of his aircraft with something nobody had successfully attached to a plane before, a central float that would allow it to take off from and land on water. That morning, Curtiss taxied his modified biplane across the surface of the bay, applied full power, and lifted off from the water. He flew at approximately 800 feet above the bay, completed his circuit, and landed back on the surface. The flight is recognized as the first successful seaplane flight in the United States. What makes this more than a historical footnote is what Curtiss understood about what he had just done. He had not simply added floats to a land aircraft. He had changed the fundamental relationship between aviation and the world's geography. A floatplane needed no runway, no cleared ground, no infrastructure prepared in advance. Wherever there was water of sufficient depth and reasonable length, an aircraft could land. In 1911, the vast majority of the Earth's surface had no runways and never would. Water was everywhere. A month after that first flight, on February 17, 1911, Curtiss gave the US Navy a demonstration that sealed the deal. He flew his aircraft out to the armored cruiser USS Pennsylvania, anchored in San Diego Bay, landed on the water alongside it, was lifted aboard by the ship's standard boat crane, set back down on the water, and took off. He had demonstrated in a single operation that an aircraft could be launched and recovered from a conventional warship without any special equipment. The New York Times reported it the next day. In a flight of 6 miles over the bay and ocean and across Coronado Island, Glen H., Curtiss rose from the water, alighted on land, and then started from the land and alighted on the water. The Navy bought its first aircraft shortly after. The Curtiss A-1 Triad, which stands for land, sea, and air, was delivered to the Navy on July 1, 1911, for $4,400. It weighed 925 pounds empty and had a maximum speed of 60 miles per hour. Its first Navy flight was made by Curtiss himself, with Lieutenant Theodore Ellison at the controls for 2 of the day's 4 hops. Ellison went on to become Naval Aviator Number 1, the first certificated naval pilot in the United States. The triad went on to achieve a remarkable series of firsts. It made the first night water landing without landing lights. It set a world seaplane altitude record of 900 feet, later extended to 6,200 feet. It completed the first cross-country seaplane flight, covering 112 miles in 122 minutes. It participated in the first catapult launch trials from a ship, though that test on July 31, 1912, ended with Ellison and the aircraft plunging into the Severn River. The triad was rebuilt and flew again. It accumulated 285 flights before being damaged beyond repair in a crash on October 6, 1912. Only the engine was saved. Curtiss was awarded the Collier Trophy in 1912 for the triad, the most prestigious award in American aviation. He was officially named the Father of Naval Aviation, a title that has stayed attached to his name ever since. The A1 triad was sold to the navies of Great Britain, Germany, Russia, and Japan. The site of Curtiss's winter flying school on North Island is now part of Naval Air Station, North Island, which the Navy formally recognizes as the birthplace of naval aviation. All of it came from a morning on San Diego Bay, a modest aircraft with a float bolted underneath it, and the moment when it lifted cleanly off the water and the world's geography quietly became smaller. A seaplane takeoff has 4 distinct phases. Each one follows directly from the last, and each one feels different from inside the aircraft. Understanding them does not diminish the experience. It deepens it. The first phase is displacement. When a floatplane sits at rest on the water, the floats are pushing down into the surface, and the water is pushing back up with exactly the same force, just as a boat floats. The float is partially submerged, displacing a volume of water equal in weight to the aircraft. At idle power, taxiing slowly, the floatplane is a boat. Heavy, settled, responsive to the water beneath it in ways that are subtly different from sitting on concrete. The surface moves. Small waves interact with the float and translate into the airframe as gentle, rocking motions. When the pilot advances the throttle to full power, everything changes. The engine takes hold, and the aircraft begins to accelerate. Water resistance builds rapidly. The floats are pressing through the surface now, pushing a bow wave ahead of them, and the drag this creates is enormous compared to anything that happens on a runway. This is the beginning of the second phase, the hump. The hump is exactly what it sounds like. The drag curve of a seaplane, plotted against speed, looks like a hill. It rises sharply as the aircraft accelerates, reaches a peak, and then drops again as the floats begin to rise. At the peak of the hump, the floats are pressing down hardest into the water. The bow wave is highest, and the nose of the aircraft is pitching up as hydrodynamic lift pushes up on the front of the floats. This is the moment of maximum resistance. The aircraft feels as though it is fighting the water. The engine is at full power, and the acceleration has slowed to nearly nothing. Inexperienced pilots sometimes pull back on the controls here, which pitches the nose up further and digs the rear of the floats deeper into the water, making the hump worse. The correct technique is to hold the elevator position and let the physics work. Because they are working, the increasing speed is generating more and more hydrodynamic lift under the floats, and that lift is pushing the floats upward in the water. As they rise, less of their surface is in contact with the water, and drag begins to fall. The aircraft is climbing over the hump in the drag curve and transitioning into the third phase, planing or being on the step. On the step, the float plane is no longer a boat. It is riding the surface of the water the way a water ski rides it, or the way the hull of a fast powerboat planes at speed. Only the forward section of each float is in contact with the water, and the contact is no longer a matter of displacement, but of hydrodynamic pressure. The aircraft is being pushed upward by the water's resistance to being moved out of the way at speed. Drag has fallen dramatically from its hump peak. Acceleration picks up again. The pilot releases the back pressure on the controls and lets the aircraft settle forward onto a flatter, faster attitude. Speed builds quickly now. The critical feature that makes all of this possible is the step, a sharp discontinuity built into the bottom of every float and every flying boat hull, located roughly a third of the way back from the nose. The step is a small but precise ledge, set at an angle that allows air to ventilate under the rear section of the float during the planing phase. Without it, the surface tension of the water would hold the rear of the float in contact and prevent the transition to planing entirely. Glenn Curtiss introduced the step in his earliest float designs. Every seaplane built since has used it. The fourth phase is liftoff. The pilot applies back elevator pressure. The nose rises slightly. The wings generate their aerodynamic lift, and the floats leave the water. The spray that had been rising in two parallel arcs off the forward section of each float drops away. The water closes behind them. From the moment the throttle advances to the moment the aircraft is cleanly airborne, the whole sequence typically takes between 15 and 40 seconds depending on the aircraft weight, the water conditions, and the density altitude. In those seconds, the aircraft transitions from boat to something in between to aircraft, passing through a state that has no equivalent in land-based flying. A brief negotiation between two different physical worlds. Then the lake closes behind the floats, and there is only sky. By the early 1930s, aviation had a problem. Land-based aircraft of the era could carry passengers between cities connected by roads and railways. But they could not cross oceans. The Atlantic was 3,000 miles wide at its narrowest point. The Pacific was wider still. The engines of the day were not reliable enough for a non-stop crossing. And even if they had been, no land aircraft could carry enough fuel for such a distance, while also carrying a useful payload of passengers and mail. The ocean crossings that had been made by then, Alcock and Brown in 1919, Lindbergh in 1927, were solo or small crew feats of endurance, not the foundations of a commercial service. The solution came from a different direction, not from making aircraft that could fly further without landing, but from accepting that they would need to land on the way, and using the ocean's surface itself as the landing field. The flying boat is the result. Unlike a float plane, where a conventional aircraft body sits above a pair of pontoon floats, the flying boat uses its fuselage as the hull. The underside of the fuselage is shaped like a boat's hull, watertight, hydrodynamically designed for takeoff and landing on water. Wing floats keep the aircraft upright when it is not moving. The entire aircraft is a watercraft that also flies, rather than a land aircraft that has had floats attached. In the early 1930s, Pan American Airways, under the direction of one Trippe, set about building the route infrastructure for trans-Pacific flight. This involved not just buying aircraft, but building facilities on remote Pacific, islands, hotels, fuel depots, radio stations, repair shops, and docks on Midway Island, Wake Island, and Guam. Tiny specks of land in the middle of the world's largest ocean, each one a stepping stone on the route from California to Asia. The aircraft built for the job was the Martin M130. 3 were built by the Glenn L. Martin Company at a cost of $417,000 each. The China Clipper, the first of the 3, was delivered to Pan American on October 9th, 1935. It had a range of approximately 3,200 miles, 4 engines, and could carry up to 18 passengers. It could not cross the Pacific non-stop, but stopping at Honolulu, Midway, Wake, and Guam. It could cover the 210 miles from California to Manila in stages. On November 22, 1935, the China Clipper took off from Alameda, California, with an estimated 20,000 people watching from the shore. Pan American President Juan Trippe and U.S. Postmaster General James Farley were among the dignitaries on the platform. On the water just offshore, the aircraft sat nose to nose with the crowd. When it taxied away and accelerated across the bay, the crowd did not go home. They stayed until the flying boat had disappeared over the horizon. The departure nearly ended in the bay. The original plan called for the China Clipper to fly over the still under construction San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge after taking off. On the day, the pilot realized he could not clear the bridge structure and flew under it instead. The maneuver worked. The aircraft continued west. It arrived in Manila on November 29, 1935, after 59 hours and 48 minutes of flying time spread across 7 days. The same journey by the fastest passenger ship took 21 days. Pan American had cut the transit time to Asia by 2/3. The only mail was carried on that first crossing, but by 1936, passengers were traveling the route in a flying boat that offered hot meals, sleeping berths, and the slow, extraordinary experience of island hopping across the Pacific in an aircraft that treated the ocean surface as its home. Fred Noonan, who navigated the China Clipper on its inaugural flight, would later become the navigator aboard Amelia Earhart's aircraft on the round-the-world attempt that ended in the Central Pacific in July 1937. His work on the Clipper routes had given him as thorough an understanding of Pacific navigation as any person alive. It was not enough, but the Clipper route kept flying. The age of the flying boat was opening. In early 1936, Pan American Airways put out a proposal to aircraft manufacturers for the next generation of transoceanic flying boat. The requirements were demanding. A range sufficient for the Atlantic crossing, capacity for a commercially viable number of passengers, and the performance margins needed to operate reliably on schedule. To focus industry attention, Pan American offered a $50 0-0 prize for the winning design. Boeing won. The Boeing 3 Fawn Clipper first flew in June 1938 and entered Pan American service in 1939. It was, at the time of its introduction, one of the largest civil aircraft in the world. Its wingspan was 152 feet. It was powered by four Wright GR 2600 double cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower, giving a combined output of 6,400 horsepower. Its maximum takeoff weight was approximately 82,500 pounds, just over 40 tons. Its range was 3,500 statute miles, enough for the Atlantic crossing under favourable conditions. 12 were built. Pan American received 12 between 1938 and 1941, paying approximately $550,000 per aircraft. In overnight sleeper configuration, the 314 carried 40 passengers in 7 luxurious compartments. At the rear of the aircraft, behind all other sections, was a private compartment with a double berth that became known to crews as the honeymoon suite. There was a 14-seat dining room where meals were served on china with silverware and linen tablecloths. Stewards prepared multi-course dinners in a galley. Passengers in day configuration without sleeping berths could number up to 74, though normal loads on long overwater routes were smaller for comfort on flights that stretched across a full day or night. The crew numbered between 10 and 16, depending on route length. On the longest crossings, pilots were rotated through rest periods in bunks built into the aircraft. Engineers could walk out through a catwalk built inside the wing to physically access the engines in flight, checking oil levels and inspecting components without the aircraft needing to land. On June 28, 1939, the Yankee Clipper, one of the Boeing 314 fleet, operated the first scheduled transatlantic passenger flight from the United States to Europe. It departed New York and arrived at Lisbon, Portugal, inaugurating regular passenger service across the Atlantic that no aircraft had previously managed to provide. A round-trip fare cost the equivalent of many thousands of dollars in today's money, placing it firmly within the reach only of the wealthy, of government officials, and of anyone whose business was urgent enough to justify the cost. The journey itself had a quality that modern long-haul flying does not. The aircraft moved at roughly 193 miles per hour, which meant the Atlantic crossing took the better part of a day. Passengers had time to sit in the lounge, eat meals, watch the ocean below through large windows, and rest in proper beds. The aircraft was loud by modern standards, the 4 radial engines producing a continuous, powerful drone, but the interior was insulated, and the experience was described by those who flew it as closer to a very fast ship than to what aviation was beginning to feel like on shorter routes. The flight altitude was typically around 10 zoo feet, low enough to avoid severe weather, but high enough to give passengers clear views of the ocean surface below. On Atlantic crossings, the ocean stretched in every direction without any landmark for hour after hour. At night, the aircraft flew in complete darkness above the water, the engines running steadily, the passengers asleep in their berths. Boeing had pioneered some technical innovations in the 314 that were not yet common across commercial aviation. The aircraft used fully feathering propellers, which could be set to reduce drag to almost zero if an engine failed. A failed engine on a 4-engine aircraft crossing the Atlantic was not automatically catastrophic. The other 3 could maintain level flight and continue to the destination. Pan American flew its last Clipper service in 1946. By then, land-based aircraft had evolved rapidly, accelerated by wartime development, and the airports needed to receive them had been built across the globe. The Boeing 345's era lasted barely 7 years in commercial service. The last surviving example was raised from Baltimore Harbor, where it had sunk after a storm and scrapped in 1951. Nothing has replaced it. There has been no regular passenger flying boat service on any transoceanic route since Pan American's last Clipper flight. The golden age of the passenger flying boat ended not gradually, but with a specific historical event: the Second World War. Before the war, the flying boat's essential advantage was geographic. Oceans, rivers, lakes, and harbors were everywhere. Paved runways, capable of handling heavy commercial aircraft, were almost nowhere outside of North America and Europe. A flying boat could land at any city with a waterfront. A land-based aircraft needed infrastructure that simply did not exist across most of the world's routes. The war changed this in a way nobody had planned and nobody fully anticipated. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allied powers built airfields across the globe at a pace and scale that would have seemed impossible in the previous decade. The Pacific Island chains that Pan American had carefully equipped with hotel rooms and fuel depots for Clipper operations now had military runways capable of handling heavy bombers. North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, the Caribbean, West Africa, Eastern Brazil, all of them acquired hard surface runways as military logistics demanded. By the end of the war, a land-based aircraft with sufficient range could land at facilities on almost every major air route in the world. The aircraft had also evolved. The Douglas DC-4, which entered commercial service in 1946, was a 4-engine land-based aircraft with a range of approximately 200 miles and capacity for 44 to 86 passengers, depending on configuration. The Lockheed Constellation, which entered service the same year, was faster and could carry comparable passenger loads. Both aircraft were more economical to operate than the Boeing 345. Both could use the new runways that the war had built. Neither needed a harbour. Against these competitors, the flying boat's advantages became disadvantages. Operating from harbours required boats, docks, marine crews, and ground equipment adapted for water operations. Aircraft had to be launched from the water, not simply pulled up to a jetway. Luggage had to move through a different logistics chain. The operating costs of a seaplane terminal were substantially higher than those of a land airport that simply needed concrete and fuel trucks. Pan American's Boeing 345 fleet, the most prestigious passenger aircraft in the world as recently as 1939, was already being phased out while the war was still in progress. The airline transferred several aircraft to the US government for military transport duties and quietly made clear that the Clipper era was ending. The last scheduled Pan-American Boeing 3 Funfawn service flew in 1946. The physics of the flying boat also worked against it in the era of pressurized commercial flight. Flying boats needed to maintain the structural integrity of a watertight hull capable of landing on open ocean swells, which imposed weight penalties. Pressurizing a boat hull fuselage to allow high-altitude cruise was considerably more difficult than pressurizing a conventional circular section fuselage. Land-based aircraft, free from the constraints of water operations, could be optimized entirely for aerodynamic efficiency, lightweight, and high-altitude cruise. They were faster. They used less fuel per passenger mile. The economics were unambiguous. The romantic side of the story is worth acknowledging because people who flew on the Clippers almost universally described it as the finest air travel experience they had encountered. Before or after, the slow crossing, the meals on China, the sleeping berths, the panoramic views of the ocean, the feeling of moving between continents in genuine comfort. These were qualities that subsequent aviation simply did not replicate in the same form. The jet age delivered speed. The Clipper age had delivered something else. The last Boeing 3 Funfawn, still airworthy, made its final flight in 1946. The last surviving airframe, the Berwick, was bought by a small British airline after the war, and eventually sank at its moorings in Baltimore Harbor in 1950. It was raised, briefly examined, and scrapped in 1951. 12 aircraft built, 12 destroyed, no survivors. The flying boats were gone, but the Seaplanes was not finished. It had simply returned to the purpose it had always been best at. While Pan American was building a transatlantic luxury service, and while Boeing was designing aircraft that could carry sleeping passengers across oceans, a different and more ordinary kind of flying boat was working in the Canadian North. It was carrying mail, medicine, and passengers between communities that had no roads, no railways, and no possibility of a conventional airstrip. The lake was the runway. It had always been the runway. And for the communities along these lakes and rivers, the sound of a floatplane's engine in the distance was the sound of the world maintaining contact. In 1946, de Havilland Canada surveyed the bush pilots of northern Canada. Not the clipper captains or the airline executives, but the men and women flying into remote lakes and communities in aging aircraft, landing on water and gravel bars and frozen rivers, hauling gear that the North needed. The question was simple. What did the ideal bush aircraft look like? The responses were collected, and a team of 5 engineers was hired to build it. The result was the de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver. It made its first flight on August 16, 1947, piloted by Canadian fighter ace Russell Bannock. The prototype, registered CF-FHB with the initials of co-designer Finer Frederick Howard Buller in the registration, was delivered to the Ontario Department of Lands and Forests the following year. The Beaver is a single-engine, high-wing aircraft with a STOL capability that allows it to operate from remarkably short bodies of water. Its all-metal construction, unusual among bush aircraft of the era, made it more resistant to the cold and damage than the fabric-covered designs that preceded it. Its Pratt & Whitney R9 and 85 Wasp radial engine produced 450 horsepower. Its design allowed the rear cargo doors to accept large, awkward loads including 55-gallon drums, which was the standard fuel container throughout the Canadian North. Between 1947 and 1967, de Havilland Canada built 1,657 Beavers. The United States Army purchased several hundred for use in the Korean War and as utility aircraft. By 1965, approximately 1,600 were operating in 63 countries. A Royal New Zealand Air Force Beaver supported Sir Edmund Hillary's 1958 Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic expedition to the South Pole. In the Amazon, in the Scottish Highlands, in Papua New Guinea, and in Alaska, the Beaver found work wherever a conventional aircraft could not reach, but a lake or river provided a landing surface. More than 900 of the original 1,657 Beavers were still flying as of 2022, according to the Canadian Bush Plane Heritage Centre. This is a statistic that rewards a moment of quiet attention. An aircraft that entered production in 1947 still has well over half its total production run flying commercially more than 75 years later. Most aviation types are retired within 20 to 30 years. The Beaver has outlasted entire generations of the aircraft that replaced it on conventional routes. The reason is simple and practical. No aircraft built since has replicated the Beaver's particular combination of load carrying, short water takeoff, mechanical reliability, and ease of maintenance in remote conditions. Many have tried. The Otter, the Twin Otter, and a succession of competing designs from other manufacturers all occupy parts of the bush aviation market. But the Beaver's specific niche, a single-engine aircraft that can be kept flying by a mechanic with basic tools, that can haul 1,000 pounds of gear into a lake with 800 feet of clear water, has not been superseded. Viking Air of Victoria, British Columbia bought the tooling drawings for the Beaver when de Havilland Canada ceased production and has supplied parts and technical support for decades. In 2019, the Vancouver-based carrier Harbour Air completed the world's first flight of a fully electric commercial aircraft, a Beaver converted to an electric motor taking off from the Fraser River. The aircraft that began its commercial life in 1948, carrying mail to Northern Ontario communities, may yet continue its working life on an entirely different power source. The lake is still the runway. The Beaver is still flying. The approach begins with the engine. From several miles away, the sound of a float plane's engine carries across open water in a way that the same aircraft's sound would not carry over land. Water reflects rather than absorbs sound, and a calm lake on a still afternoon is a near-perfect acoustic reflector. The engine note arrives first, a low throb that seems to come from somewhere above and ahead, and then the aircraft itself appears, small against the tree line or the hills, descending toward the water's surface. The descent is gradual. A float plane approach to a lake is not the steep, angle-controlled glide of an instrument landing on a runway. The pilot is descending more shallowly, scanning the water surface constantly, reading what the conditions are telling them. If the lake is rippled by wind, the surface texture gives clear information. The wave shadows show the direction the wind is moving. and the height and spacing of the chop indicates the strength. The approach will be made into the wind, the same way every landing on any water surface is made, to reduce the aircraft's speed relative to the surface at the moment of contact. The flaps extend. From the ground or from a boat on the water, this is visible as a change in the aircraft's attitude. A slight nose up, a slight increase in drag, a decrease in speed that makes the aircraft seem to hover for a moment against the sky before continuing its descent. The engine note softens as power is reduced. The floatplane is committing to the lake now, no longer keeping options open in the way that a higher, faster aircraft can. The moment before contact is the quietest part. The engine is at reduced power, just enough to maintain the approach path. The aircraft is perhaps 50 feet above the water, and the surface is coming up slowly. If the lake has any ripple at all, the floats and their reflections are visible from below, closing the gap between the real float and its mirror image. In perfectly still, glassy conditions, there is no mirror image because there is no reflection. The surface is transparent to depth, and the pilot cannot see it clearly. This is the most technically demanding landing condition in floatplane flying. Approaching a surface that appears to have no surface. Contact. The floats touch the water and the spray erupts in two parallel arcs, one from each float, sweeping outward and upward as the forward momentum of the aircraft encounters the resistance of the water. From a distance, this looks almost like wings. Two broad fans of white water rising from the point of contact and spreading behind the aircraft. The nose dips slightly as hydrodynamic forces take hold. The aircraft is no longer flying. It is planing, shedding speed across the water the way a stone skips before it sinks. Though the floatplane does not sink. It settles. The engine power comes back as the aircraft slows, partly to maintain control, and partly to continue moving toward the dock or the shore. The spray diminishes. The aircraft has transitioned from planing to displacement, the floats sinking back into the water to the depth corresponding to the aircraft's weight. The bow wave that had been pushed ahead of the floats during the planing phase spreads outward and laps gently against the shoreline. Then the engine idles or cuts completely, and the silence moves in. Not the silence of nothing, because a lake is never silent. There are birds, and wind, if any, and the gentle sound of water against the aluminum floats. But the engine, which has been the dominant sound for the entire approach, is gone. The aircraft sits quietly on the water, its own small waves spreading outward from the floats in a circular pattern that passes under the dock and across to the far shore. For anyone who has arrived at a remote Canadian lake or an island in the Pacific Northwest by floatplane, this sequence carries a particular emotional weight. The approach and landing represent the completion of a transition from the connected world to the unconnected one. There are no roads from here. The aircraft brought you in from beyond the tree line, through the air, over the water, to this specific quiet dock. The moment the engine stops is the moment you have arrived, and the silence that follows is not empty. It is full of wherever you have just landed. Before a floatplane pilot lands, they read the water. This is not a metaphor. It is a practiced, specific skill that takes dozens of water landings to develop and hundreds more to fully trust. The water surface is a continuous real-time record of what the atmosphere above it is doing, and a pilot who knows how to interpret that record can extract wind direction, wind speed, wave height, wave period, water depth, potential hazards, and available landing distance from a surface that, to an untrained eye, looks like nothing more complicated than a lake. Wind direction is the first and most essential reading. A floatplane always lands and takes off into the wind, for the same reason any aircraft does. Headwind reduces ground speed at takeoff and landing, making both safer and requiring less distance. On a lake with no access to a weather broadcast, the pilot reads the wind from the water. Ripples on a lake move in the direction the wind is blowing, and their shape tells the story. On the upwind side of a lake, typically protected by the shore or the tree line behind it, the water is calmer and the ripples are smaller. The downwind side, exposed to the wind's full fetch across the water's surface, shows larger waves and more texture. A pilot circling a lake before landing can determine the wind direction from these patterns within a few seconds. Smoke from a cabin stovepipe on shore, flags or laundry on a dock, the direction of reeds bending at the water's edge, all of these supplement the water reading, confirming what the surface is already showing. Wave height and period are the next assessment. Floatplanes have limits for the wave conditions they can operate in. A de Havilland beaver on floats can handle waves up to a certain height before the landing risks structural damage or loss of control during the transition from planing to displacement. Before landing, the pilot counts the waves. How high are they from trough to crest? How long is the distance between crests? How regularly are they spaced? Irregular, confused chop is harder to manage than long, regular swells, because the float contact is unpredictable. Glassy water is the most counterintuitive hazard in floatplane flying. To a passenger, a completely calm lake looks ideal. No waves, no turbulence, flat and smooth as a table. To a pilot, a glassy lake is one of the most dangerous conditions they will encounter. The reason is perceptual. The human visual system determines distance to a surface by reading its texture. Rough water provides that texture clearly. Glassy water, which reflects light uniformly, provides almost none. From above, a perfectly still lake becomes visually indistinguishable from air. The surface simply cannot be located with any precision by the eye alone. Pilots have devised techniques to manage glassy water landings. The FAA specifies a constant descent approach. Set a fixed descent rate of around 150 feet per minute and a fixed airspeed, and maintain both all the way to the surface by reference to instruments, not by looking out the window. The floats will find the water when it arrives. The pilot resists the instinct to look for visual confirmation of height above the surface. They trust the instruments and the rate of descent they have set. Even experienced floatplane pilots describe glassy water landings as requiring a particular kind of concentrated calm. You are descending toward a surface you cannot see, at a rate you have calculated, trusting that the numbers are right. The floats touch, the spray appears, and you know the approach is over. A floatplane pilot who has been flying northern lakes for 20 years has read tens of thousands of water surfaces. They have seen every variety of wind condition, every type of chop, every grade of morning calm and afternoon churn. They have landed on surfaces lit by the low sun of October afternoons, where the glare off the water makes the entire lake a mirror of white. They have landed at dusk, when the water is grey and the tree line is dark, and the only clear features on the approach are the dock lights. They have landed in light rain, which paradoxically makes the water easier to read by breaking the glassy surface into a fine, even texture that restores depth perception. All of this reading, all of this assessment, happens in the minutes and seconds before each landing. It is quiet work, done at low altitude above a surface that is telling everything to anyone who knows how to listen. In 1991, a Norwegian businessman named Lars Erik Nielsen was on a boat crossing from one Maldivian atoll to another. The crossing was rough. The passengers around him were seasick. The journey by boat was taking far longer than it needed to, and it was genuinely uncomfortable for everyone aboard. Nielsen looked at the water around the boat, and then at the sky above it, and decided there had to be a better way. The Maldives is 1,192 islands, arranged across 26 atolls in the Indian Ocean. The capital, Malé, sits on an island roughly 2 square kilometers in area, and the international airport that serves the country occupies a separate small island next to it. Most of the resort islands that form the basis of the Maldives tourism industry are between 30 minutes and 2 hours from Malé by boat, in good conditions. In rough conditions, the crossing can take longer, and it is rarely comfortable. For visitors arriving after a long international flight, a 2-hour boat crossing as the final leg to their resort is not an ideal introduction to a luxury destination. Nielsen founded Maldivian Air Taxi in 1993 with 2 aircraft. The concept was straightforward: carry resort guests from the airport to their island by air, over the same water that the boat would traverse in a fraction of the time. The aircraft he chose were de Havilland Twin Otters, fitted with floats. They could carry up to 15 passengers, land on the lagoon adjacent to any resort, and complete the journey that took 2 hours by boat in under 30 minutes by air. The view from the window during those 30 minutes, the rings of turquoise coral atoll lagoon, the deep blue of the open ocean, the white sand islands from above, became itself one of the celebrated features of the Maldives experience. The business grew with the resort development of the Maldives through the 1990s and 2000s. A parallel operation, Hummingbird Island Helicopters, had started in 1989 with a helicopter fleet and later transitioned to seaplanes under the name Trans-Maldivian Airways. In February 2013, both companies were acquired by Blackstone Group and merged under the Trans-Maldivian Airways name. The merger created a single dominant seaplane operator in the Maldives and the world's largest commercial seaplane operation. Trans-Maldivian Airways now operates more than 60 de Havilland Twin Otters, carries over 1 million passengers annually, and serves more than 80 resort islands across 14 atolls. The carrier operates more than 100,000 flights per year, making its base at the Nuvilu Seaplane Terminal, adjacent to Valana International Airport in Malé, the busiest seaplane terminal in the world. The $55 million facility handles the continuous flow of resort transfers from early morning to late afternoon. Seaplanes arrive, discharge passengers and baggage, reload, refuel, and depart in a rotation that runs without pause through the daylight hours. Operations stop at sunset. Seaplane landings on the Maldivian lagoons require visual conditions. After dark, resort guests who need to reach distant islands transfer to fast ferries, or where available, domestic airports with conventional runways. This means every passenger using Trans-Maldivian Airways is arriving or departing in daylight, with the full panoramic view of the atolls that is one of the defining impressions of a Maldives visit. The de Havilland Twin Otter, which carries all of these passengers, is a Canadian aircraft first flown in 1965 and still in production in updated form today. It seats 15 passengers, carries a crew of 2 or 3, and is powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney Canada PT6A turboprop engines. It is the same aircraft that works the bush routes of northern Canada and Alaska, fitted with amphibious floats and carrying doctors and mail to remote communities. In the Maldives, the same airframe carries honeymooners in resort transfer livery over turquoise lagoons. The geography has changed completely. The aircraft has not. The lagoon is the runway. The destination is somewhere across the water. The aircraft is the only practical way to get there. In this, the Maldives is not so different from a lake in northern British Columbia in 1948 when the first beaver arrived. The principle is the same. The view is considerably warmer. Before the de Havilland Beaver was designed, the engineers who would build it did something unusual for 1946, they asked. De Havilland Canada sent questionnaires to Canadian bush pilots, the people who were actually flying into remote lakes and rivers every week in aging aircraft with fabric-covered wings that cracked in the cold and interiors too small for the loads they needed to carry. The company wanted to know what the ideal bush aircraft looked like from the perspective of someone who depended on it for their livelihood and occasionally their life. The responses were nearly identical. Every pilot said the same things: more power, better short takeoff and landing performance, the ability to swap between wheels, floats and skis depending on the season, and cargo doors large enough to accept a 55-gallon drum. Speed was not mentioned. When engineers pointed out that optimizing for power and STOL capability would compromise cruise performance, one pilot's response, which has been quoted many times since, was simple: you only need to be faster than a dog sled to be a winner. The design that came from this consultation was the DHC-2 Beaver. Its power plant, the Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Junior radial engine, producing 450 horsepower, was chosen over a less powerful British engine, partly because of the power requirement and partly because the big radial sitting exposed at the nose of the aircraft could be maintained by a mechanic with basic tools in conditions where sophisticated equipment was not available. The engine was first built in 1929. The Beaver made it still relevant well past the middle of the century. The high wing design keeps the engine and propeller clear of water spray during takeoff and landing runs. the entire trailing edge of the wing is hinged. Flaps and ailerons together span the full rear of the wing, giving the Beaver a short field lift capability that allowed it to operate from water bodies shorter and smaller than most contemporary aircraft required. The cargo doors at the rear of the fuselage open wide enough for 55-gallon drums as requested. The cabin accommodates up to 6 passengers, or an equivalent weight of freight. The rear seats can be removed quickly and completely, converting the aircraft from a passenger carrier to a freight hauler in minutes. This convertibility was intentional and was used constantly in the bush. A mail run in the morning might become a medical supply run in the afternoon. On floats, the Beaver sits low to the water. The floats themselves, typically Edo 4580 or whipline equivalents, depending on operator preference, are aluminum structures divided into multiple watertight compartments so that a puncture in one section does not compromise the aircraft's buoyancy. Water rudders at the stern of each float, connected by cables to the rudder pedals in the cockpit, provide directional control on the water at slow speeds. Before takeoff, the pilot retracts these rudders to prevent them from striking underwater obstacles or being damaged by the hydrodynamic forces of the planing run. Loading a Beaver for a bush run is a practiced art. The center of gravity limits are tight, and loading 1,000 pounds of freight into a small aircraft without placing too much weight forward or aft requires knowing the load, knowing the aircraft, and having loaded it many times before. Experienced bush operators develop a feel for the loading that goes beyond calculation. They can look at a pile of boxes and drums and equipment and tell you approximately where the CG will land before they have loaded a single item. The Beaver cruises at approximately 130 knots, or roughly 240 kilometers per hour. It is not a fast aircraft by any measure. A commercial airliner on the same route, if such a route existed, would cover the distance in a fraction of the time. But the Beaver's destination does not have a commercial airline route. It has a lake, 800 feet of clear water on a calm morning, and a dock where someone has been waiting since the weekend for the supplies this aircraft is carrying. More than 900 of the 657 Beavers built are still flying commercially as of recent years. The airframe that first flew in 1947 is still the best tool available for the specific job it was designed to do. That is not nostalgia, it is engineering. The floatplane calendar of the subarctic runs on water and cold rather than months and seasons. It opens when the ice goes out and closes when the ice comes back. Between those 2 points, the summer can be long and luminous, or brief and unreliable depending on the year, but it is always bounded by freeze and thaw, and every pilot who works those routes knows the calendar by the state of the lakes. In northern Canada and Alaska, ice out is one of the most anticipated events of the year. Through the winter, the lakes are closed. First, frozen solid enough to drive vehicles across, then gradually weakening through March and April as the days lengthen. The moment varies by year and by lake. A pilot who has flown the same territory for 20 years has learned to read the ice the way they read the water in summer, estimating thickness by color, watching for the dark patches that indicate thinning, Monitoring the shore leads where open water first appears. When the ice finally goes, it can happen in a matter of days. The last sheet of winter breaks up, and the water surface opens, and the float season begins. The first float plane of the season onto a newly opened lake has a particular status in the communities that depend on it. The winter has been supplied by ski planes, by ice roads where they existed, by snowmobile loads where they didn't. The float season means fresh produce arriving weekly instead of sporadically, easier passenger travel, more flexible cargo schedules. The sound of that first float plane of spring carries a weight that is difficult to translate into aviation statistics. The summer in the subarctic is not long, but it is intense. Above the Arctic Circle, the midnight sun means that a float plane can operate at 11 p.m. in the same visibility it would have at 11 a.m. Pilots working northern routes in summer regularly fly through hours that would be night elsewhere, the light staying level and gold across the tundra, and the lakes shimmering under a sun that sits on the horizon and refuses to set. The photographic beauty of this environment is real, and pilots who have worked it for decades still describe evenings of flight that they have not found words adequate for. The mosquitoes, which arrive with the warmth and disappear when the cold returns, are also real and considerably less romantic. The mud season sits between freeze and thaw, and it is universally regarded as the worst time to operate in the bush. The ice roads are gone. The lakes are not yet open. The land is a saturated marsh that defeats wheeled vehicles. During breakup, surface travel in the northern bush becomes close to impossible. The float plane is grounded because the lakes still have ice, and the ski plane is grounded because the snow is too soft. For a few weeks every spring, the communities that depend on air service are partially isolated from each other in a way that is different from, and in some ways more complete than, their winter isolation. This is the gap in the calendar that pilots and community members endure and do not particularly discuss, because there is nothing to be done about it. When the ice goes out and float operations resume, the beaver or twin otter comes off its winter skis, which are removed and stored, and the floats are fitted in their place. The process takes a trained ground crew several hours. Then, the first water run of the season, checking the floats for leaks, testing the water rudders, getting back the feel of a machine that has been on skis for 5 months. The water feels different under the floats after the ice, colder, thicker with spring snowmelt, the colour of the sky it is reflecting on this particular morning. Then freeze up comes again. The first ice appears in the sheltered bays by mid-September in the far north, a thin skim that breaks up overnight for a few weeks before thickening into something permanent. The floats come off, the skis go back on, the calendar closes. And the same operation that moved in summer on lakes moves in winter across those same lakes, frozen, using the ice as both road and runway. The landscape transformed, but the territory and its communities unchanged, still dependent on the machine that arrives from the sky with what they need. The most useful aircraft in existence may be one that does not care which surface it is landing on. An amphibious seaplane carries retractable wheels inside its floats or hull, wheels that fold up for water operations and extend for land operations. It can land at a conventional airport and refuel at a standard fuel pump, then take off, fly to a remote lake, land on the water, and continue its day. No other aircraft type carries this flexibility. Every other commercial aircraft is committed, at the moment of departure, to the kind of surface it will arrive on. The amphibian is not. The checklist discipline this requires is demanding. The single most common serious accident in amphibious aircraft operations is landing on the wrong surface, with the wheels in the wrong position, wheels retracted onto a paved runway, or wheels extended onto water. Both are catastrophic. An aircraft landing on a paved runway with its wheels up will grind onto its keel, destroying the float structure and almost certainly the aircraft. An aircraft landing on water with its wheels extended will flip forward onto its nose almost instantly, submerging within seconds. Neither outcome is compatible with walking away. To prevent these accidents, amphibious aircraft have dedicated checklists, warning lights, and in modern aircraft, automated reminder systems that alert the pilot to an inconsistency between landing surface and gear position. The culture of amphibian flying includes a particular emphasis on the before landing checks. Every experienced amphibian pilot has a firm habit of stating aloud, before every landing, which surface they are approaching and what position the gear should be in. The articulation is deliberate. Saying water landing, wheels up, is not just a checklist item. It is a moment of conscious commitment to a decision that, once the aircraft is 30 feet above the surface, can no longer be safely reversed. The history of amphibious design runs from the Curtiss Triad of 1911, the first amphibious aircraft, through the great flying boats of the 1930s, many of which carried retractable wheels for shore operations. The Grumman Goose, a twin-engine amphibian that first flew in 1937, served across Alaska, the Caribbean, British Columbia, and numerous other island and coastal routes for decades. It was a 6 to 10 passenger aircraft that could land at a city airport, continue to an island with no runway, and return to the airport for refueling. Airlines using the Goose operated some of the most geographically complex route networks in aviation because the aircraft made the geography irrelevant. The consolidated PBY Catalina, primarily a military patrol aircraft of the Second World War, was also an amphibian. It patrolled the Atlantic in search of submarines, rescued downed airmen from the open ocean, and served as a transport across routes where no land infrastructure existed. Many found their way into civilian use after the war, and flew as bush aircraft and charter services into the 1980s and beyond. Some still fly today, maintained by enthusiasts with the patience and resources to keep 1940s flying boats airworthy. The Icon A5, a modern two-seat light amphibian that entered the market in the 2010s, brought the concept to recreational flying in a sleek, composite airframe. It was designed to be easy to fly for pilots without extensive seaplane experience, and its folding wings allow it to be trailered to a boat ramp rather than stored at an airport or seaplane base. It represents the most recent iteration of an idea that is now more than a century old. an aircraft that treats both land and water as home. Regardless of generation, all amphibious aircraft share one characteristic. The pilot, who flies one regularly, develops a dual literacy, able to read both the runway environment and the water surface, able to make the landing surface assessment in either medium, able to transition between two completely different operational worlds within the same flight. It is a specific and uncommon skill set. The aircraft requires it. In exchange, it goes anywhere. The Canadair CL-215 was designed for one purpose, and it was designed for it completely. In the early 1960s, Quebec forestry officials asked Canadair to develop a more effective way to deliver water to forest fires. The aircraft that existed for the role at the time were converted bombers and transports, aircraft built for other purposes and adapted for firefighting, with varying degrees of success. What was needed was an aircraft purpose-built from the beginning around the requirements of the job. Fly to a fire, deliver water, return to a water source, reload, and repeat, rapidly, repeatedly, for hours. Canadair began design work in 1963. The definitive design received program approval in February 1966. The CL-200 made its first flight on October 23, 1967, and the first production aircraft was delivered to the French Civil Protection Agency in June 1969. The CL-215 is a high-wing twin-engine amphibious flying boat, powered in its original form by two Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines. Its hull is designed to withstand the repeated impact of water landings, which, in firefighting service, can number dozens per day. It carries a water tank in its belly, filled not by landing on a lake and pumping water aboard, but by scooping it. The aircraft skims the surface of a lake at approximately 70 knots. Two water scoops on the bottom of the hull open into the flow, and in approximately 12 seconds, the tank fills. The aircraft never stops. It touches the water surface briefly, barely slowing below flying speed, takes on its load, and lifts off again. The original CL-215T could scoop approximately 1,176 gallons in that 12-second run. The upgraded CL-45T, which entered production in the 1990s with turboprop engines, replacing the radials and numerous airframe and systems refinements, increased the water load to approximately 1,621 gallons, scooped in the same 12 seconds. The scoop inlets are approximately 10 by 12 centimeters in cross-section. Despite a persistent urban legend, they cannot scoop up a diver or swimmer. The openings are simply too small, and the hydrodynamic pressures involved are too low at the brief contact speed to ingest anything larger than sediment and small debris. A CL-415 on an active fire can complete a scooping run, fly to the fire, drop its load, return to the water source, and repeat the cycle in approximately 10 to 12 minutes when the lake is close to the fire. In a single hour of operation, one aircraft can deliver between 12,000 and 16,000 gallons of water. It can do this for as long as the crew's duty day allows, and as long as the fire and the water sources remain accessible. The scooping run itself is a precise piece of flying. The pilot approaches the lake at low altitude and descends to the surface. touching down at approximately 70 knots, which is well above normal landing speed. The aircraft is in a shallow planing run, not a full displacement landing. The hull touches the water surface at flying speed. The scoops open into the flow, and the crew monitors the tank fill rate. If the lake is too small, too shallow, or too encumbered with obstacles for a full scoop, a partial load can be taken. The minimum water source for a scoop run is approximately 6.5 feet deep and 300 feet wide, and the scooping path does not have to be straight, since the aircraft is still aerodynamic during the run and can be steered around obstacles. After the load is taken, the pilot advances the throttle and the aircraft accelerates off the lake surface, now heavier by 1,621 gallons of water. The takeoff run is longer and requires more power than an empty departure. The whole sequence from water contact to airborne typically takes less than 500 meters of lake. The CL-415 currently operates in Canada, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Croatia, and was deployed to assist in the January 2025 Los Angeles wildfires. Canada operates the largest national fleet. France, which received the first CL-215 in 1969, has been operating successive versions for more than 5 decades. The aircraft that fights forest fires from the air does it by treating the lakes and rivers it needs. As refueling stops it never has to land at, the water it carries was a lake 10 minutes ago. In 10 minutes, it will be lake water falling on a fire from 150 feet above the flames. Japan is an archipelago nation. Its maritime borders extend into some of the most demanding ocean conditions in the world. The Pacific to the east, the Sea of Japan to the west, the East China Sea to the south. All of them produce sea states that can make open water rescue by conventional means extremely difficult or impossible. For a sailor or fisherman in trouble 200 kilometers offshore in a Pacific storm, the options for rescue narrow quickly when the waves are 3 meters high and rising. The Shinmaiwa US-2 was designed specifically for this environment. Shinmaiwa Industries, a Kobe-based aerospace company that traces its seaplane lineage back to the Kawanishi Aircraft Company of the wartime period, began development of the US-2 in 1995 as an upgraded replacement for the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force's aging US-1A search and rescue seaplane. The requirement was demanding. The new aircraft had to be able to land on open ocean in sea states that would prevent conventional rescue operations, carry injured survivors aboard, and return them to a mainland hospital. The sea state requirement, specifically, was waves up to 3 meters in height, corresponding to sea states of 4 to 5 on the international scale used for maritime operations. For comparison, most other seaplanes in current service are limited to wave heights of approximately 1 to 2 meters for safe water operations. The US-2 achieved this through a combination of hull design, boundary layer control technology, and very slow approach speeds. Boundary layer control works by blowing high-pressure air over the control surfaces and wing, allowing the aircraft to maintain lift and control authority at speeds far below what would normally be safe. The US-2 can make a water approach at speeds of approximately 50 knots. Landing on 3-meter waves at low speed The hull is designed to absorb the impact of wave contact without structural failure, using a hull geometry that has been refined through decades of Shinmaiwa's seaplane experience. The first flight of the US-2 prototype took place on December 18th, 2003. The first production aircraft was delivered to Japan's Ministry of Defense in February 2009. 9 have been built as of recent production figures. The fleet is small, but its capability is unique. No other maritime nation currently operates a seaplane with comparable open ocean rescue capability. The aircraft is powered by 4 Rolls-Royce AEE 2100J turboprop engines, each producing 4,590 horsepower. Its maximum range exceeds 4,700 kilometers, sufficient to reach most of Japan's maritime rescue responsibility zone, and return without refueling. Its cruising speed is approximately 480 kilometers per hour. When it is not flying search and rescue missions, it can be configured as a transport or, in a version Shinmaiwa has developed, as a water bomber carrying 15 tons of water for aerial firefighting. The JMSDF operates the US-2 from Iwakuni Air Base in Yamaguchi Prefecture. When a maritime distress call is received, the aircraft can be airborne in a matter of minutes. The search phase uses a combination of radar, infrared sensors, and old-fashioned visual observation through bubble windows, designed to provide downward visibility to crew members using binoculars. When the survivor is located, the aircraft descends to the sea surface and lands in whatever conditions prevail. Medical treatment can begin immediately in the equipped cabin. The US-2 represents a continuation of large seaplane technology at a time when most of the world's aviation industries have moved away from it entirely. Japan has maintained the capability not for historical reasons, but for genuinely practical ones. The geography of the country, the maritime zones it is responsible for, and the sea states that occur regularly in its surrounding waters make an open ocean rescue seaplane a more rational tool for certain situations than any alternative. While Boeing 314 Clippers were being scrapped in Baltimore Harbor in 1951, the argument that was used to justify them, that some places can only be reached by a flying boat, was not being refuted by events. It was simply being acknowledged by fewer and fewer operators. Japan did not stop acknowledging it. Sound behaves differently over water than over land. On land, sound is absorbed by vegetation, terrain, buildings, and the ground itself. A sound source on a forested hillside reaches a listener on the same hillside, partly through the air and partly diminished by the trees and ground cover between them. The result is a sound environment that is relatively close, relatively contained, shaped by the landscape it moves through. Over water, the dynamics change. A calm lake surface reflects rather than absorbs sound. Sound energy that would be scattered and dampened by land travels across open water with much less attenuation. The flat, reflective surface acts like a very large, imperfect mirror for sound, bouncing energy along the water and delivering it to a listener at the far shore at a strength that surprises people who are used to hearing sounds over land. This is why a floatplane can be heard coming long before it is visible. In northern communities that depend on floatplane service, The sound of the aircraft arrives several minutes ahead of the aircraft itself. First, a low throb at the edge of audibility, something that might initially be dismissed as wind or the movement of the lake itself. Then, the throb resolves into a distinct engine note, rhythmic, the percussion of a radial engine's cylinders firing in their staggered sequence. Then, louder. Then the aircraft appears over the tree line. For generations of people in remote communities across northern Canada, Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, Scandinavia, and northern Australia, this sound has carried a specific set of meanings. The float plane brings the mail. It brings fresh food that has not been available since the last delivery. It brings medicine, spare parts, tools, documents, news from outside. It sometimes brings a doctor or a nurse for a scheduled clinic. It takes people away and brings them back. The routine of a remote community's connection to the larger world has been organized around the floatplane schedule for the better part of a century, and the sound of the engine approaching is the sound of that schedule being kept. The specific acoustic character of a radial engine adds something to this. The Pratt & Whitney R985 Wasp Jr. that powers most de Havilland Beavers has a sound that experienced listeners can identify from a distance, a distinctive, throaty, uneven beat caused by the firing order of its 9 cylinders. It is not a smooth sound. It has a pulse to it, a mechanical personality. That is quite different from the even hum of a turbine engine or the lighter sound of a small piston aircraft. People who grew up with the Beaver as the delivery vehicle of their remote community recognize that engine note the way they recognize a voice. The Twin Otter, which powers the Maldives seaplane fleet and serves many of the same northern routes as the Beaver, has a different sound. The higher-pitched whine of 2 PT6 turboprops, cleaner and more consistent than the radial pulse. It carries differently across water, a sharper note against the horizon. Remote communities that transitioned from Beaver service to Twin Otter service in the 1970s and 1980s noticed the change in the arrival sound as something specific, a sensory marker of the aircraft generation shift. There is an acoustic effect, specific to seaplane departures, that is less often described, but just as distinct. After a floatplane lifts off from the lake, the surface behind it is disturbed. Waves spreading from the takeoff run, white foam where the spray was heaviest, the entire near surface in motion. As the aircraft climbs away, the engine sound recedes, not just in volume, but in character, the Doppler shift lowering the pitch as the aircraft moves away. The lake settles. The waves that the takeoff generated travel outward and eventually reach the shore, arriving there as a gentle series of ripples long after the aircraft is out of sight. The last wave from a floatplane departure can take several minutes to reach a far dock. By the time it arrives, the aircraft is 20 miles away, but the lake is still carrying its record of the departure, working it out to the edges until the surface is still again, and there is only the sound of whatever was there before the engine started. A floatplane pilot approaching a remote lake they have never visited before has no approach control, no tower frequency to call, no weather observation from a station nearby, and no instrument landing system guiding them toward a measured, surveyed surface. They have the aircraft, their training. What they can see from the window and whatever they have learned from other pilots about conditions in this region. The assessment begins before the lake comes into view. 30 miles out, the pilot is already reading the sky. The cloud base and its texture tell the story of what the atmosphere is doing. A smooth, uniform overcast means stable air. Broken cumulus with active vertical development means thermals, turbulence, possible showers. The wind at altitude is visible in the cloud movement. The pilot notes the direction, estimates the speed, considers how much it is likely to differ at lake level, where terrain effects can significantly change both direction and strength from the conditions even 1,000 feet higher. As the lake comes into view, the reading shifts to the surface. The first piece of information is the obvious one. Is the lake free of ice? And is it large enough for the aircraft's needs? Then, the specific assessment begins. The texture of the surface in the lake's lee, the sheltered zone behind the upwind shore, shows the wind direction. Smooth water there means the wind is coming from that direction, pushing across the lake toward the rougher downwind end. The pilot plans to land into the wind from the downwind side toward the upwind shore, which means overflying the landing area first on a descending pass to check for obstacles, submerged logs, a hidden reef, a boat tied without lights near the shore. Then the descent. The pilot uses available reference points to build a picture of their altitude above the water. The shoreline treeline is useful. At known terrain height, it gives a frame against which the descent can be checked. The dock, if there is one, provides another reference. The pilot is building a three-dimensional picture of the approach area from the inside of a descending aircraft using peripheral visual references, the altimeter and their rate of descent indicator, to construct an approach that will bring the floats to the water at the correct speed, correct angle, and correct point. The weather assessment does not stop at the point of commitment to the approach. The pilot continues reading while descending. Smoke from a cabin ashore that was visible on the first pass over the lake may have shifted direction, indicating a wind change. The color of the water may reveal a new patch of calm that was not visible from altitude, suggesting a downdraft or a shift in the surface flow. The light may be changing as a cloud shadow crosses the lake, altering the visual texture of the surface. All of this happens in a compressed time frame. From the decision to land to wheels in water takes perhaps 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, an experienced bush pilot has made dozens of assessments that they could not individually name, assessments built from a decade of the same kind of flying that has trained their visual system to recognize patterns and anomalies faster than conscious thought can organize. The weather and the water and the terrain all connect for a bush pilot in a way that they do not for a pilot who flies between equipped airports with weather observations, ground radar, and precision approach aids. The floatplane pilot is in direct negotiation with the environment on every flight, and the negotiation depends on accumulated reading skills rather than instrument support. This makes bush flying genuinely different from other kinds of flying. Not more dangerous when done well, but different in the kind of attention it requires and the relationship it creates between the pilot and the landscape. The most experienced bush pilots are quiet about their skill. They know it is built from repetition, from the accumulation of thousands of small readings made over thousands of flights. They know it cannot be summarized or abbreviated. It has to be developed, one lake at a time, one season at a time, until the assessment is not something they do, but something they are. The float is the least glamorous component of the float plane, and the most fundamental. Everything the aircraft does on water, every taxi, every takeoff run, every landing, every moment of rest at a dock, depends on the float. A standard floatplane float is an aluminum structure roughly 5 to 7 meters in length, depending on the aircraft it supports. It is shaped like a shallow boat hull from below and flat or lightly contoured from the deck. The forward section, the bow, comes to a relatively sharp point that cuts through the water and deflects spray to the sides. The sides flare outward at the waterline in a feature called the chine, the junction between the side surfaces and the bottom. The chine's angle and geometry affect how the float behaves at speed. A well-designed chine deflects spray outward and downward rather than upward, protecting the propeller and airframe from water ingestion during the takeoff run. The single most critical feature of the float is the step. Located approximately 1/3 of the way back from the bow, the step is a sharp transverse break in the bottom surface, a discontinuity that creates a deliberate ledge. During the planing phase of a takeoff, air enters under the rear section of the float at the step, breaking the water's adhesion to the aft surface and allowing the float to plane on its forward section only. Without the step, the surface tension and suction of the water would hold the full length of the float in contact, preventing the transition to planing and making takeoff in many conditions impossible. Glenn Curtiss introduced the step in his earliest float designs in 1911, and it has been a feature of every float and flying boat hull built since. Inside the float, the structure is not hollow. A series of internal bulkheads divides the float into at least 4 watertight compartments as required by aviation regulations. Each compartment is sealed from the others so that a puncture or crack in one section admits water only to that section, not to the entire float. The float can support the aircraft with any 2 compartments flooded, which makes the aircraft very difficult to sink through float damage alone. Small drain points at the bottom of each compartment, called bilge pump openings, allow water that seeps in over time to be pumped out. Pilots check the bilges as a standard pre-flight item. Water accumulates in floats regularly from condensation, from splash during landing, and from minor seepage around seams. Water in the float adds weight and can shift the aircraft's center of gravity if the accumulation is asymmetric between left and right floats. At the stern of each float, a small water rudder folds down from the underside, connected to the rudder pedals in the cockpit by cables and springs. The water rudders provide directional control when the aircraft is taxiing slowly on the surface, when aerodynamic control from the aircraft's rudder is insufficient because the speed is too low to generate meaningful airflow over the tail. Before takeoff, the pilot retracts the water rudders into their stowed position to prevent them from striking underwater obstacles during the planing run. After landing, they are extended again for water maneuvering. The retraction and extension of water rudders is a routine checklist item before every takeoff and landing, so embedded in the floatplane pilot's habit structure that it becomes involuntary, like glancing at mirrors before changing lanes. For amphibious floats which add retractable wheels to allow landings on pavement, the structure is considerably more complex. Each float typically contains one main wheel and one nose wheel, both of which are hydraulically actuated from the cockpit. The gear cycles down and locks for land operations, and cycles up and locks for water operations. The hydraulic system must be reliable. A gear that extends partially or that fails to lock presents a serious risk on either surface. Modern amphibious floats incorporate redundant systems and warning indicators that alert the pilot to any discrepancy between commanded and actual gear position. The float weighs several hundred kilograms. Adding floats to an aircraft increases its empty weight substantially, reducing payload and slightly degrading climb and cruise performance compared to the same aircraft on wheels. This weight penalty is the price of operating from water. For aircraft whose destinations have no runways, it is not a penalty at all. It is simply the terms of the arrangement. The afternoon is getting long. The mountains ahead are already holding the first suggestions of shadow in their east-facing valleys. Though the peaks are still in full light, the glaciers catching the afternoon sun in a way that makes them look as if they are lit from within. Below the aircraft, the coast mountains of British Columbia extend in every direction, with the unhurried enormity of a landscape that has not been significantly altered by human activity in most of its extent. The lakes down there are unnamed on most charts. The trees between them have never been logged. The aircraft is a de Havilland Biava on floats, cruising at approximately 130 knots at 5,000 feet, following a valley that runs roughly north to south between two ridgelines. The engine note is steady, the radial's 9 cylinders firing in their characteristic staggered beat. The world outside the windows is mountains and forest and water, the late light finding the texture of each surface and rendering it in detail. The roughness of granite above the tree line, the smooth dark mass of the spruce and fir below it, the occasional lake flashing bright silver or deep blue depending on the angle of the sun. The destination lake comes into view around a bend in the valley. It is perhaps 2 kilometers long, narrowing slightly toward its far end, where a creek runs in from the upper basin. The surface is flat and the color of the sky at this hour, a pale gold in the western half, where the light is falling directly. A darker blue in the east, where the ridge has already thrown its shadow. There is a dock at the near end. Weathered boards and 2 cleats, a painted line marking the edge of the float stop. It has been here for decades. The float plane that originally built this dock is long retired, but the dock remains. The pilot begins the standard assessment. The surface of the lake shows a light ripple from a southerly breeze. The wind, confirmed by the movement of the upper branches on the near shore. The approach will be made from the north into the wind, giving maximum headwind for the landing. The pilot circles the lake once, descending to 500 feet, scanning the surface for obstacles. No logs visible, no debris near the dock, the landing lane clear. The sun angle means the approach will be made looking slightly into the light, which the pilot notes and adjusts for. Power reduces. The nose drops slightly. The aircraft descends toward the lake with the unhurried deliberateness that a good approach always has. Energy managed, configuration stable, the descent rate around 400 feet per minute. The flaps extend to their landing position. The engine idles back to just above idle. The tree line ahead gets lower as the aircraft descends through it, and then the lake surface is in direct view. The gold ripple on the near half coming up toward the floats. At 10 feet above the water, the ripple is visible as individual small waves, a few centimeters high, and the float reflections are clear in the water. The pilot holds the attitude, letting the aircraft settle the last few feet at its own pace. Contact. The floats touch with a sound that is at once a rushing of water and a low, solid thump as the displacement phase begins. Spray rises in the characteristic twin arcs. The aircraft decelerates through the planing phase, the speed dropping quickly, the spray dying back. The nose comes down as the aircraft settles into displacement mode. The engine idles. The lake is settling around the floats. Spray arcs are gone. Small waves radiate outward from the float positions, spreading toward the shoreline in a pattern that will take several minutes to reach the dock. The aircraft is moving at slow taxi speed, turning toward the dock on water rudders. The propeller wash stirs the surface behind it in a gentle disturbance. The engine cuts. The dock comes up to the float at walking pace, and a line goes to the cleat. The mountains are still in light. The valley is quieting. The surface of the lake, which was disturbed for approximately 40 seconds by the arrival of this machine, is already smoothing itself back toward the stillness it held before the engine note arrived over the ridge. By the time the sun drops behind the western peaks and the last color leaves the water, the lake will be a mirror again. We began here, a glassy lake at dawn, a float plane at rest on the surface, the world reflected in the water below it. That image has not changed, because this is where every seaplane story ends and begins, on water that does not hold a record of what it has seen. The runway that Glenn Curtiss used on January 26, 1911, no longer exists in any form. San Diego Bay is still there, still water, still reflecting the sky above it. But the surface he lifted from that morning left no mark behind. The water he disturbed closed over. The bay continued its tidal cycle. The waves he generated in his takeoff run reached the shore, dissipated, and were replaced by other waves from other causes. Nothing of the first seaplane flight is preserved in the medium that made it possible. The same is true of the China Clipper's departure from Alameda Bay on November 22, 1935. The 20,000 people on the shore watched it lift off the water and disappear westward toward Honolulu. And then the bay settled again, and the surface that had briefly held the weight of a 40-ton flying boat was indistinguishable from the surface that had never known one. The Boeing 314 Clippers that crossed the Atlantic to Lisbon and Marseille in 1939, and the years that followed, left no permanent mark on the ocean. The BY Catalinas that patrolled the Atlantic for submarines and rescued downed airmen from the open sea, the de Havilland beavers that have worked the northern bush lakes for 75 years, the CL-405D water bombers that scoop from French lakes to fight summer fires in the Provençal hills, the Shinmaiwa US-2 that lands in Pacific swells to retrieve survivors who had stopped expecting rescue. All of them land on surfaces that immediately resume their previous condition. The water releases the aircraft the moment it lifts off, and the departure is gone. This is different from every other form of transportation. A road is a permanent modification of the landscape, maintained and defined by use. A runway is a surface built specifically for the purpose, its existence defined by the aircraft that use it. A rail line is a permanent inscription in the ground. Even the unpaved bush airstrip bears witness to what it has served. The flattened, compacted surface shows the landings it has accepted. Water shows none of this. It shows whatever is happening to it now. The float plane that touched down at dawn has been forgotten by the surface before the engine has been tied down at the dock. This is the seaplane's particular freedom. It does not require permanence. It requires only that there be enough water of sufficient depth and adequate length, with reasonable weather, and an aircraft capable of reading what the surface is telling it. The lake it lands on this afternoon may be a lake it has never touched before. The lake it will land on tomorrow may not yet be decided. Every takeoff is from a surface that existed before the aircraft arrived, and will exist after it leaves. The machine leaves no claim on the water. The water imposes no obligation on the machine. Whatever keeps you listening tonight, the world outside is still moving in its own rhythms. The lakes across northern Canada are settling toward their own dawn. The Maldivian atolls are sitting quiet in the overnight hours, the twin otters tied at the Nuvalu terminal, waiting for the day's first transfers. Somewhere in the Japanese Pacific zone, a US-2 crew is on standby. Somewhere in British Columbia, a beaver is at a dock on a lake that does not know it is there. The water is still. The floats are resting at displacement, the aircraft gently keeping time with the surface beneath them. Whatever runs out there, whatever needs to be carried or fetched or reached, is waiting for the morning. For now, the lake is a mirror. For now, the engines are quiet. The water remembers nothing. It holds everything gently, and then it lets go.